So how should we understand the latest development of the investigation, and what are the painful lessons learned from Tuesday's Manchester arena blast? We turn to our panelists right now. In Beijing, joining us, Yan Shuai, an analyst at the Anti-Terrorism Center at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome to our program. In London, we invited Mr. Nigel Inkster, who is the Director for Future Conflict and Cybersecurity at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also former Assistant Chief of British Secret Service. Thank you for joining. I understand that for medical reasons you have to wear glasses, but I really appreciate it that you are still with us today. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, joining us in Paris, Mr. Timo Lohocki, who is a transatlantic fellow with the Europe program at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome as well. Gentlemen, I want to start with the latest development of the investigation. Mr. Inkster, this is not the first time that you and your colleagues are encountering with such a crisis. Help us understand some people on the run while one blowed himself. What exactly do you think needs to be urgently done by the police and also the army right now in the UK?
Right. Well, in terms of the investigation, what we saw was one individual detonating a suicide bomb. What we don't know is whether this individual actually built the bomb or whether there is somebody else out there who is capable of building further such bombs, and whether there are further individuals who are prepared to act as suicide bombers. So understanding this, I think, is very important. I don't think it's possible, realistically, to learn to build a terrorist bomb from the internet. This is something that you've actually got to do for real. You've got to do it hands-on. And what this means is that somebody somewhere has been properly trained to do this. So that's the first point. As to the military, I think the main role of the military is twofold. Firstly, to provide protection for high-profile targets that need to be protected so that the police can be freed up for other things. Secondly, to serve as a readily deployable force in the event of a further terrorist incident, particularly a so-called marauding attack in which somebody takes a gun and starts shooting into a crowd. And thirdly, just for reassurance for the public.
I see. Those are very important information for now. Mr. Lohocki, of course, at this point, the level of alarm is critical, which means there could be an imminent threat of terrorism still inside the UK, but also it means a lot to the other European capitals as well. Mr. Lohocki.
Well, I do want to second the previous speaker. I do think the raising of security level so far is largely intended to free police forces in the UK to aid the investigation and to create a level, or say a feeling of assurance for the British public. So far, I would say that the impact in other European countries is rather limited, given that the terror level in other European countries remains unchanged, and so far the police, at least in the most important European states, haven't seen or couldn't investigate yet whether there is a link between these bombings and terror attacks and terror challenges in their countries, meaning that so far I do think the impact remains largely focused on the UK so far.
We want to go a little bit in history to take a look at what happened over the past 10 years or so in terms of the types of terrorist attacks and its impact and what were behind them. The Manchester arena attack is the deadliest in the UK since the 2005 central London bombing. On July the 7th, 2015, Islamic extremist suicide attackers set off bombs on 3 separate trains on the London Underground and 1 on a double-deck bucker, also leaving 56 people dead and 700 others injured. On March the 22nd this year, British man Khalid Massoud drove a car into the pedestrian on the Westminster Bridge before crashing into the Palace of Westminster, leaving 6 dead. 2 days ago, of course, the latest incident, but some have been suggesting there has been a way of change how these terrorist attacks are being done and what could be and who could be behind them. Mr. Inkster, do you see the patterns have changed and the reasons, even though we're still under investigation right now for this one, have changed at all?
Yes, I think there's been a significant change. Since 2001, the prevailing model of jihadist terrorism was the Al-Qaeda model, which was, so to speak, top-down, centrally directed, carefully constructed plans that were carried out in particular countries, but always directed by controllers at what was effectively Al-Qaeda's headquarters. And the aim was always to try to achieve outcomes comparable in scope to the Twin Towers attack in 2001. The thing about this approach is that it requires a lot of connectivity. It gives intelligence agencies a lot of opportunities to get across and to disrupt this kind of attack. Plus, they're actually very difficult to do. What we're now seeing is a new variant of jihadism, which is more bottom-up. What the Al-Qaeda jihadist ideologist Abu Musab al-Siri wrote about in his global call to Islamic resistance, which is basically groups of people working to a broad central directive, but with a lot of leeway to undertake activities with some degree of control, but with also a degree of autonomy. And the concern is more about achieving an outcome rather than necessarily trying to replicate the circumstances of the Twin Towers attack.
Mr. Yan, you are also an anti-terrorism expert. You see some pattern changes over the years. Previously, it was much more coordinated. It seemed there are many people behind one specific incident. And yet you see more and more so-called lone wolf operation with terrorist groups eventually claim the responsibility, yet hard to verify. What do you make of this change at this point? Which is more dangerous to you?
Yeah, after the 9/11, we have seen quite a few significant large-scale terror attacks, especially in Western world. But this is mainly due to the increased counterterrorism measures taken by these countries. So the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, like this kind of terror groups, they don't have much chances to carry out a large-scale attacks against them. But at the same time, they called for the lone wolf attacks. This kind of attacks with the increased skills and the availability of equipment such as rifles, guns, and explosives. Right. So they become more and more deadly compared with the past. But at the same time, what we should pay attention is that although Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State pay a lot of attention to call for the lone wolf attacks, they do not give up the plans to carry out large-scale attacks. Actually, currently ISIS has some organization in its organization. It's called ENMI, and it's has it's intelligence agency, secret unit in the ISIS organization, and it has a special unit responsible for planning significant and coordinated large-scale attacks against the West.
So that is extremely dangerous. Of course, that means much more coordination urgently needed among capitals inside Europe. Mr. Lohaki, of course, Europe has experienced so much over the past few years with new immigrants, the Syria crisis, many other things, terrorist attacks included. So do you think capitals are really prepared, even though they try to talk about their preparedness, particularly when it comes to coordination?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer
right.
in a very brief sentiment. I think the most important thing is twofold. For one, the question is how can you prevent that these attackers, these possible threats, enter European soil, and here, especially given the migration situation, being not as controlled, not as thought through as it could have been in the last 2 or 3 years. Most certainly more coordination amongst European capitals is needed in order to forge a coherent European migration and counter-terrorist strategy. However, I do think what we've seen over the last years is that most or a significant share of the attacks carried out were carried out by individuals which have been living in the respective countries for a longer time already, meaning a coordinated or thought through migration strategy policy would have had a very limited impact on these attacks. So the question remains how intelligence sharing and security cooperation amongst capitals can ensure or can decrease the chances for further attacks on these matters. And this again depends on intelligence sharing and to what extent information sharing is indeed capable of tackling these matters. But I do think, as we just heard, these lone wolf attacks require a very limited degree of cooperation and a lesser degree of interaction amongst possible challengers or possible attackers.
Right.
So the question remains if intelligence sharing is even feasible or is even the proper tool in order to prevent these attacks.
It's a very good question, I guess. It's an ultimate question we really need to ask right now. I want to go back to you, Mr. Yingster, about those questions. Are we going to see crises one after another with bigger frequencies even than what we experienced over the past few years? And what we have, the tools in hand to prevent at all or only to root out terror groups and terror lone wolves once incidents like these happen? Please be frank with us.
Yeah. Okay, well, firstly, we have to recognize, and we've said this many times, that this is a generational problem. It's not going to be something that's solved in 3 or 4 years. We've got to recognize that most serious terrorist campaigns do tend to last a generation. I think this one will be no exception. Secondly, the character of terrorism is that terrorist incidents are episodic. You go for long periods without anything happening, and then all of a sudden you get a cluster of events.
That's right.
And this is why terrorist acts can be so destabilizing. Thirdly, I think this is a learning process. Intelligence agencies, police forces are learning all the time. But counterterrorism investigations are a bit like doing a jigsaw puzzle. In Chinese, 拼图游戏, against the clock, but without knowing when the clock runs down, not knowing what the end result is going to look like, and with the almost certainty that some of the pieces are missing. I mean, that is what a counterintelligence investigation feels like.
Right.
So inevitably, there's always going to be some improvisation, but we are getting better at this. But what we have is an action-reaction dynamic. As the intelligence agencies identify one set of techniques and get better at dealing with them, the terrorists adapt and go elsewhere.
That's right. Mr. Yan, of course, this time we see that IS claimed the responsibility. We have seen this as a critical moment. It was the time when U.S. President Donald Trump, so-called the leader of the free world, visited the Middle East. It is also the time when the UK is trying to make a decision, so-called on the Brexit process. So what would this, in a way, reflect the realities of what we call the Western world and the choices that they have to make at this critical juncture? Mr. Yan.
This is the major background that the Islamic State has carried a series of attacks in the West. Actually, currently, the ISIS is facing a mounting military pressure from the international community, especially after the United States Trump administration taking into office. Trump voted to increase and accelerate its military campaign against the Islamic State. And we also see that in recent 2 days, Trump visited Middle East countries, and there he met with more than 50 Islamic State of heads, and they agreed to establish a kind of military alliances and called for the Islamic countries to devote more than 30,000 military personnel to combat Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. So we are seeing that Islamic State may be defeated militarily by the end of the year. So, and this background, the Islamic States urgently need to carry out attacks to show its power, to show that it still strong and can stand up with the outsider military campaigns against it.
Certainly we see this is not only just attacks, but also propaganda wars between us, the civilized world, and the terrorists themselves. Mr. Lohaki, at this point, as Mr. Yan just illustrated for us, what can governments do? On the one hand, military clampdown of the IS is going on and probably likely to get ever more intense. And on the other hand, you see this group struggling, quote unquote, to survive and probably will counterattack even more. So how should we go through this critical moment? Mr. Lohaki.
I do think, as we just heard, it's very important to emphasize and reiterate that this very problem is not new and it won't vanish in the coming months or the coming years.
Yeah.
So aside from intelligence and military countermeasures, the most important task for Western governments is to prepare their societies, their electorates, their citizens, that this very situation is here to last. We just heard it might last an entire generation, it might last a few more years, it might last 2 more decades. It will most certainly not go away in the coming months and years. This means that the government needs to send a multifaceted message to their citizens. For the first, it is that the governments will do all they can to improve security matters, while at the same time trying to ensure civil liberties. For the second, though, they need to be very honest with their voters, with their citizens, and say, we will do all we can, but we will not be capable of preventing all terror attacks. On the contrary, it is very likely that we will see further attacks despite our efforts to counter them. And thirdly, they should emphasize the time frame we're talking about here. This very problem is going to be with us for various years to come, and they need to create, you might say, a sort of civilian resilience, as we currently see in Manchester, that people do not get intimidated by these attacks, but accept them being here for the foreseeable future and not changing the way of life, because this is exactly what these terrorists are trying to aim for.
Right. But of course, these attacks and counterattacks always work with the local politics as well. Before we go, we only have 45 seconds left. I do want to ask you, Mr. Yinster, as you've been working on the intelligence on terrorism for a long time. So how should we read the picture? Domestic politics vis-a-vis, all of these tragedies and yet terrorist attacks. How would that work? What advice?
Well, yeah. Well, one of the big risks, one of the aims of the jihadists is to create political and social strife in the countries where they're undertaking the attacks. They want to elicit populist, right-wing reactions, overreactions, so that they can then create a kind of self-fulfilling narrative. And it's therefore absolutely critical at times like this that politicians get together, put aside their differences, and start delivering some coherent and consistent messages.
And certainly we've been hearing that from different European capitals, also from President Trump of the US, and also from the Chinese President Xi Jinping as well. It seems that the support is coming from all over the world for the UK right now. Thank you so much, gentlemen.